Hi, this is Jeffrey Tucker of the Brownstone Institute, and I'm thrilled to be here with my friend Thomas Massie, Congressman from Kentucky. Thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Hey, thanks for what you're doing at the Brownstone Institute, and thanks for having me on to set the record straight.
Well, this is what we need to do. I'm very worried about this because I'm getting scared that we're concerned that we're not going to tell the history of what happened properly. And there's a few things that I kind of want to get codified for the record about your involvement from the very early days. So if we could go back to March 2020, and if you could explain to me, what your intuitions were initially when we heard the slogans, flatten the curve.
Yes, we were going to flatten the curve, right? And we were told that we would take just 15 days to slow the spread. And on about the fourth day to slow the spread, I woke up early in the morning and did some math. I did some calculations. And by the way, I went to MIT. I did undergraduate and graduate degrees there in engineering. So I've had a little bit of math. I understand differential equations, but it wasn't even necessary to bust out the diffie-qs to figure out that 15 days was not going to slow the spread. And I calculated it was going to be, if this strategy was going to have any effect, it would have to last for months and months, that it would go at least through the summer if it was going to have any effect at all. And I waited for my wife to wake up. She also went to MIT. So I got her to check my homework as she did when we were at MIT. And she said, I think you're right.
And you did this based on the existing case reporting and
Yes.
what was presumed to be the R naught at the time, the infection rate?
That's correct. At the time, we had information from cruise ships, for instance, which are kind of like little test tubes or petri dishes to look at, okay, if you assume complete exposure, how many are going to get it? How many will come down? How many will it be fatal with? And so I made some, quick estimates and some assumptions. My assumptions, were probably too rosy even. And I later that week or that day, I broke it to my staff. I told them, I said, I've done some math. This is not 15 days. And so on Easter, our governor sent out state troopers to take down the license plates of people who defied him to go to church. But and also there was a woman who tested positive for COVID in Kentucky, and they wanted her to sign a document to say that she wouldn't leave the state, she wouldn't leave her house. And she agreed not to leave her house, but she refused to sign a document. She thought, well, what if I have to go, if there's an emergency, life or death situation? They sent police to her house and put an ankle bracelet on her in Kentucky to track her. And so, all of these horrific things we saw on the news happening in China were happening in the United States. Meanwhile, Jeffrey, and again, we're in, let me get us back to about the fourth day of 15 to slow the spread. We're being told we're going to vote on a giant spending package. And, the numbers were changing. We weren't sure what the numbers would be. How much would the money be? And I was waiting. I was on call. I was ready to come to D.C. and debate that and vote on that. And meanwhile, they were making preparations for continuity of government. Now, this is where things are going to sound conspiratorial, but I can point you back to articles that show what was happening. In the event that the branches of government quit functioning, there's sort of a military government that would take over in this country to maintain law and order. And they were making preparations for that. And they were telling people, if you remember also, not to leave your state. There was a discussion whether to shut down all the New England states, whether basically to stop all traffic in and out of New York State. There were discussions, serious discussions about that. You can go back in the news and find these things.
Yeah. Can we just go back? So
Yeah.
March 12th, flights from Europe blocked. or at least stopped. And so everybody had to come back by Monday or Tuesday, causing massive overcrowd. The Fauci, Burkes, Trump press conference occurs on Monday, the 16th, at which Fauci clarified, everything has to shut down: bars, restaurants, all public events, if there's evidence of community spread, he said. Burkes is saying, new rule, everybody has to stay separate from everybody else. And that was on Monday. So by Friday, you're saying there's already talk of a gigantic spending bill.
Yes, gigantic, unprecedented. And so I'm sitting there at home. It was actually, I believe it was a Wednesday or Tuesday evening. I think it was a Tuesday evening. And I saw Trump's people come on TV, and Larry Kudlow was one of them. And he said, well, it's not really a $2 trillion bill. You're underselling it. It's a $6 trillion bill. We're going to give $400 billion to the Federal Reserve, and they can loan that out at a 10-to-1 ratio and inject another $4 trillion of liquidity into the economy, and it'll be really $6 trillion. And when I realized that the Republicans were bragging that this was $6 trillion, not really $2 trillion, don't undersell it, I thought, we are in trouble.
Yeah.
And then shortly thereafter, I get an email from House leadership that says, stay home. We don't need anybody here, and we're going to pass this. By the way, we still didn't have the wording of it. We're going to pass the bill with nobody in Congress. Now, this concerns me on many different levels. Number one, if the branches of government quit functioning, that gives an excuse for the folks who are up there circling in airplanes ready to roll out the plan for continuity of government that doesn't include the legislative branch or even the existing people in the executive branch.
That's what they wanted. I mean, clearly, that's the way they've behaved for 2 years, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it bothered me in that part. It also bothered me that this was the biggest spending bill in history. Even the omnibus bill is half that size. So the omnibus bill, which sets records every year, is typically like $1 trillion or $1.1 trillion. And this was going to be over $2 trillion. If you listen to Larry Kudlow, it was a $6 trillion bill. And the final thing that bothered me the most is it's just flat out unconstitutional to pass a bill with nobody there. The Constitution says that you have to have a quorum to do business. In other words, to pass bills that are going to have any legal effect.
Meanwhile, you've got public health authorities saying quorums are just going to be super spreader events, so we can't have them, essentially.
Right. Although, by the way, there was a way for Congress to vote one at a time. We could have gone into the chamber one at a time and voted. There's no requirement that you all be in the room at the same time, unless you're trying to pass a bill without a quorum. And somebody notes the absence of one. By the way, this was a technical detail I argued with Nancy Pelosi on for about 15 minutes, that it would be safer for us to vote on the bill than to have a quorum call. But we'll get to that point in chronologically 3 days from what I'm speaking about now. So at 11 p.m. that evening, I resolved to go to D.C. and tell them, you're going to have to vote on this. And by midnight, I had my bags packed. I got in my car. It typically takes about 8 hours to get to D.C. for me, but I hadn't slept, so I slept for 1 hour in a truck stop. By the way, I stopped at 3 places to buy gasoline in West Virginia, and they were all closed. And there are the signs erected on the interstate: get off the interstate, trucks only, stay home. If you can remember, the whole world was in a panic at this time, and people were ready to take advantage of it.
Yeah, and everybody's forgotten this. I'm so glad you're telling this. Those were terrifying weeks. The third
exit I took off the interstate, I found a gas station where you could buy gas with a credit card. It was unattended. It was like the zombie apocalypse or something. And so I filled up my tank with gas. I slept for an hour in a truck stop after that. And then I made it to DC by 9 a.m. And you can go back and look in the record of, it's on tweets. In my tweets, this is sort of documented. I think, they knew I was there. So, they were accusing me of trying to delay the vote, but they had fiddle-farted around for about a week. The Senate had passed this, and the Senate showed up to pass it, by the way. Two senators were not there who might have objected due to COVID. They weren't there. Rand Paul and Mike Lee were not in attendance because one of them had had COVID and one of them had been exposed to COVID. And so that's another reason why I ended up bearing the brunt of this. So I showed up that morning, and this is documented in social media history in my tweets. There's these breadcrumbs in the records you can go back and look at if anybody doubts this. And I told people, I, for instance, tweeted out that the Constitution requires a quorum. I was trying to sort of acclimate my colleagues into the fact that they were going to have to show up and vote. And I did something I almost never do. I told our own whip team what my plans were. The whip team says, don't surprise us. Just tell us what you're going to do. We just don't want to be surprised. Well, then they take that information and they weaponize it against you. And I knew they were going to weaponize it against me, and they did. They ginned up by Thursday when I, in no uncertain terms, told them we were all going to come and vote because I was going to require it. And by the way, the parliamentarian who's ecumenical, he's neither Republican nor Democrat. He'd been there for 4 or 5 speakers of the House. He agreed with me. He told them, Massie's right. His interpretation of the Constitution is spot on. And the Constitution says the House can make its own rules, but those rules can't violate the Constitution. And the Constitution requires a quorum. So they knew I was right. They were going to have to come and vote. They were, and they ginned up the entire media against me. Even Fox was demonizing me. You can go back and hear Geraldo Rivera saying, how bad I was and how this was such a bad thing for me to do. And meanwhile, they did find some things about the bill they didn't like. They found, $25 million for the Kennedy Center for the Arts, as if like that was the problem with the bill, that it wasted a little bit of money here or there. Not that it was going to bankrupt our country or that it was going to basically put all the governors in a moral hazard where they had to shut down their own economies.
Right. Maybe we want to go there because I don't think this critique is widely understood. In other words, every time I make it, people are shocked by the point. I got the point from you. I had never thought about it. I mean, your point is that and this is called it was called the CARES Act. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I called it the Don't CARES Act.
Yeah. But your argument from the very beginning was that this would operate as a kind of a subsidy for the lockdowns. It would perpetuate lockdowns. Yes. Can you explain how that works?
Until a year later, there weren't really any federal lockdowns or mandates or things like that. It was all being promulgated by the governors. But it was done, number one, with the imprimatur of Dr. Fauci and Dr. Burkes. They were, skipping around to all the state health departments and giving the imprimatur of the federal government to do these things. And in fact, if the governors had gone the other way, after hearing the advice from the federal government, it would have opened them up to a lot of lawsuits. Because here you had, the CDC and the NIH and the top scientists in the federal government advising one thing. So you had the imprimatur of the federal health policy experts that worked for Trump at the time. They had too much slack to go do this. And then meanwhile, you had the funding from the federal government. And one of the arguments my constitutional conservative colleagues was making that I was a little bit sympathetic to at first was that this is a taking. And the Fifth Amendment requires us to compensate people for takings.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. the takings hadn't happened yet. We were bribing governors to do the takings.
Okay.
And by the way, if the state does the taking, it's not the federal government's obligation to do the paying back.
Right.
And the ultimately, the only thing I thought that would bring the governors to their senses is when they shut down their own economies, they would not have tax revenue, and they can't print money, and they would be shutting down their own governments.
Right, but then suddenly after the CARES Act passes, I mean, of course there's tremendous pressure now already from the bottom to give us money, we want this money, and then after it started arriving, there was no reason to open up. Suddenly, I mean, the federal government became benevolent and generous in a way we had never seen before in our lifetimes.
Right, and you had things like minimum basic income. If you look at some of these policies, it was like we're just going to give you money. And by the way, it was a $2 trillion bill, but I said the $1,200 checks were the cheese in the trap. That people saw $1,200, but if you multiplied, and I thought I would get some sympathy from the Democrats for this. If you looked at how much money was going out and compared it to the $1,200 checks that were going to go out, it was like, 10 to 1. The money was going somewhere else. It wasn't going to individuals. But nobody was doing the math on that. And by the way, Jeffrey, just to close out this point, Ron DeSantis, who in my opinion is the best governor, bar none, in the United States, even he shut down Florida for a little while as soon as the CARES Act passed.
Oh, okay.
It was he was also put in the same situation. But he did something brilliant. He banned Dr. Fauci and Dr. Burkes from coming to Florida and talking to any state employee. That was a stroke of brilliance. So you're not going to spread the imprimatur of the federal government and establish that baseline here in Florida. You're banned. And he banned them.
Yeah, so he was suspicious from the beginning about this, but it took him a long time to finally, I don't think he opened up Florida entirely until about August, right? Or may have been sooner than that, July.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact timeline, but again, I want to give him a lot of credit because he was at the forefront of this. But what I'm saying is the federal government really put all the governors in a bind by sending out this money. And that was my problem with it, is the policies were bad. You were going to pay people not to work. And by the way, I pointed out at the time, for about a month, I went on a road trip of shows trying to explain to people all the bad things that were going to emanate from this. For instance, I own a farm, and I'm connected to a lot of farmers in Kentucky. And I realized if you don't plant fruit trees that summer, it takes 3 years for a peach tree to bear fruit and 5 years for an apple tree to bear fruit. And if those people who normally plant those trees aren't planting them, the tail on these shortages and price increases is at least 5 years long. I took some of my cattle to a processor that processes beef cattle, and I saw healthy dairy cattle being processed into hamburgers. Because at the time, because of the shutdowns, we had dairy that couldn't go into the market. Farmers were feeding dairy cattle, milking them and pouring the milk out because it was normally packaged to go to schools and to go to restaurants. And it wasn't packaged for selling in restaurants. And they didn't even have enough equipment to package it to sell it in restaurants. So they didn't just pour out the milk. You can only do that for so long. They were butchering dairy cattle. It takes 3 years from the time you decide you want a milk cow to create a cow that can milk. I mean, the mother has to gestate. It has to be born. It has to reach breeding age. It has to be bred itself. And then it gets its milk when it has its first calf. That's a 3-year process. Those were the things I was trying to explain at the time that we were touching off by telling everybody to stay home and not go to work.
And that's just one sector. You've got, tens of millions, right? You've got the chip issue abroad and God knows what happened to baby formula. So these supply chain issues were utterly wrecked by these closures, not just domestically, but internationally.
Absolutely wrecked. And still, we're feeling the long chain of this, the bolus. I don't even know that we're at the peak or the tail end of it yet, because they sort of compound. These issues compound. Anyways, this was my great fear. By the way, it was a living nightmare for me to see this 3 years, 5 years into the future, the kids who are going to miss 2 years of education and socialization and whatnot. By the way, there was, at the time, this is another bit of irony, the CDC was telling everybody, including Congress, not to wear masks. Like, just to go back and look at the video of me there in Congress demanding the roll call vote and the quorum, and to see that nobody had a mask on.
Yeah, that's right. That was, yeah. I remember that was briefly. That was also the time when the virus was considered to be inside. No, it was considered to be outside, so we had to be inside. And then later the virus moved.
Yeah, and it was droplets. And by the way, Nancy Pelosi later created a plexiglass box in Congress after accusing me of putting everybody in Congress at risk of losing their lives. Come January 3rd of the next year, she created a plexiglass box with no top in the gallery of Congress, right below the air conditioning vent, where the air is being blown into the House of Representatives, for people with COVID to come and vote for her to be Speaker. Okay, so back to the date of, yeah. It was, I believe, the 10th day of 15 to slow the spread, where I made the motion. It went from Wednesday to Thursday. Yeah. Again, they're fiddling around. They came up with this plan. Instead of passing it by unanimous consent, they were able to placate some of my colleagues by offering instead a voice vote instead of unanimous consent, which are virtually the same. And, in effect, they are the same. The only difference being they would debate the bill. They would spend 4 hours debating the bill. And if you wanted, you could register, instead of voting against the bill, you could register your objection during the debate. By the way, each side had 2 hours. The time was equally divided. And everybody was here in Washington, D.C., because I was quoting the Constitution and it required them to show up. And I went to the man managing the time on our side, the congressman, and I said, when can I have a minute, or, a couple minutes, or a minute, or 30 seconds even, to debate this bill? And he said, oh, we didn't know you wanted to speak on this issue, and so you're not in the queue. We don't have time for you to debate it. Can you imagine that? They all hate me for breathing air because I compelled their attendance on the biggest spending bill in history. And they claim that they wouldn't even yield me 30 seconds because they didn't know I was interested in discussing the merits or demerits of this bill.
How was the vote finally taken? Was it just a voice vote?
So this is interesting. I had to decide at what point I was going to exhaust all of my avenues of protest. I was on the floor watching the floor. By the way, I was whipped. But if people don't understand what whipping means, the name is appropriate. When you first hear, oh, they whip members of Congress to get them to do something, you think something bad. And then you find out, oh, it's just trying to get them to vote a certain way. But then once you understand what the whip process involves, it's a I don't want to say it's waterboarding, but it's an exercise in psychological warfare. They get your friends to call you. They call you in the middle of the night. They call you in the morning. I was sleep deprived. I had people calling me at midnight. I had people offering me better committee assignments. I received a phone call from the president. At the instant I was supposed to make the motion, it would be in order to make the motion, I got 3 phone calls from the White House. And I presumed I knew who that was, but I couldn't leave the floor because I there's a moment where things are in order, and if you miss that 3-second window, it's gone for all of history. And nobody would even cover that moment if I went to the bathroom. I had to sit there for hours to make sure they didn't do a sneak, the quarterback sneak. So I get these calls, and I couldn't take them. Obviously, I was busy, occupied, but eventually stepped out when they yielded some time to somebody, and I realized there would be a few minutes where they couldn't sneak the bill through. I walked out into the speaker's lobby, and I called the president back, and that was a fun phone call. And by the way, I'm not going to go into all the details of it, because he has graciously, 2 years later, he's now endorsed me this week.
Well, and anybody who's curious can look up the public record about the names you were called and who said what to whom. So I think that's out there, and I encourage everybody to do so. Strange times, because all this happened under a Republican House, Senate.
It was a Democrat House, but a Republican president. But the Republican minority leader was one of the people who was whipping me to vote, not just to vote for it, but just not to object.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you have to decide what your battle is. And as I approached that day, I decided that my battle was just to try and get a recorded vote. And so I requested a recorded vote, and something that has never happened in the 8 years that I had been in Congress, and something that's never happened since that day, they denied my recorded vote. And I had earlier, a few years before, asked the parliamentarian, what would transpire if you were denied a recorded vote? How would they arbitrate that? Because you have to count. The Constitution says if 20% of Congress wants a vote, you have to give the vote. And I said, well, how would you count that? How would you physically, what would be the process for that? And he said, Mr. Massie, it's so messy, we've never denied anybody a recorded vote, and we likely never would. Well, on this day, they did. And I'm not saying that 20% of Congress did stand. In fact, 20% of Congress did not stand. They were all in their seats. Maybe there were 5 or 10 out of 435 who stood. And then something else that's unprecedented in the history since the beginning of Congress happened that day. They counted people present who were only in the gallery. Like, typically you have to be on the floor to participate, but they recognized people in the gallery as being present. Long story short, they denied the recorded vote. I made note that a quorum was not present. They said a quorum was present. And at that point, there may have been other parliamentary avenues for me to pursue. But at that point, I let them own their mistake. At that point, I had done everything I could do.
Yeah.
And by the way, when I stood up, they didn't give me 30 seconds, even 30 seconds or 5 minutes to debate this bill. So I did something that is not in order. And instead of just making a motion that a quorum is not present, I got about 20 seconds of speech out before they ruled me out of order. Then I made my order. I said, Madam Speaker, I'm here today to make sure that our republic does not die by unanimous consent in an empty chamber. And I object on the basis that a quorum is not present. I saw them about to gavel me down, but at least I got one sentence into that debate and injected it while I was making my motion.
Absolutely, absolutely beautiful. Can I ask a slightly naive question? Because I don't understand. Nobody understands how this stuff works. But March 12th, we got the shutdowns happen. HHS on March 13th releases a document that says, if community spread gets bad, we're going to shut everything down. But Trump has not given the order yet. March 16th, he goes out to the press conference, having been persuaded over the course of the weekend, now we should shut down. 10 days after that, you've got a bill. How big? I mean, it
was enormous, but I didn't print it out. I don't even know that there was time to print it out, but it was, I think, 2.2 trillion in hard dollars, and they said 6 trillion in spending authority, basically.
I mean, here's the question I have: who wrote this? I mean, somebody had to. Like, who's in charge? Where does this stuff come from? If all the politicians are panicked at home, worried about COVID, and the government shut down, what are these bills? I mean, is there some machine out there that cranks them? I mean,
it was written in part by the White House. The White House had a lot of input into it.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I was told, by the way, one of my best friends is Mark Meadows, okay? And you can believe they employed him to whip me. He was chief of staff at the White House at the time. And by the way, I have to say I love Mark Meadows dearly. The two of us architected the coup that took out John Boehner.
Yeah.
So we've been in the trenches together. And he didn't really try to whip me that hard. But I told him, I said, Mark, this is the biggest spending bill I've ever seen. It's way too much money. And he said, well, it is. It's more money than we need. The reason it's so big is so we don't have to come back and pass another one. Now, he probably thought that at the time. I didn't believe it. And later we came back and spent another 4 trillion after that first 2 trillion. So he was not correct in his assessment. But he had input into it. I'm telling you that the White House had input into it just based on my discussions with Chief of Staff Meadows. And, there were people from Wall Street that had input on it. This is where I would have expected AOC and Bernie Sanders to speak up, because this was the biggest transfer of wealth from the middle class to the upper class in the history of humankind. And the Roman emperors couldn't pull this off.
Do you believe that all this happened between the 16th and the 24th? I mean, do you really believe that a bill this size with this level of specificity and was hatched in those 10 days?
I don't know. I can't go too deep into that, but I can tell you, I think one of the reasons they were so upset is with the prospect that I might delay the bill, is that some transactions had already occurred and that it would be illegal. What they had done would be illegal if they didn't quickly also pass the bill to consummate the transfers that were happening. Because you see, this is March 27th, it's a Friday, and then there's a weekend, and the quarter ends on March 31st. And it was so irrational that they would get so upset. Or maybe somebody stood to collect interest on $2 trillion over the weekend. What would be the interest on $2 trillion in somebody's bank? But it doesn't make sense. Maybe someday somebody can go back and exhume the artifacts of the transactions and the wire transfers and what actually happened.
There's a lot of strange things. I mean, I even think about this HHS March 13th document, which is apparently secret. I don't know if you even saw it at the time, but New York Times reported on it about a month later. I mean, they already had a blueprint out before Trump had been persuaded. So,
and I don't know if we're going to get, I want to make sure we don't forget about this when we're laying down what's happened here, because this is one of the most important things. If you go look at the Fed's balance sheet in March, they did a couple things. One, the balance sheet tripled overnight, somewhere in that period. And they say part of that's due to they redefined certain terms, on the money supply. They show the money supply also went up enormously, and they said, "Well, that's because we changed."
I think it was in May. Am I right about that?
No, well, you may be right, but here's the main
balance
point.
sheet anyway. It was already expanding before the bill was passed.
Yeah, but here's I don't know when the definition changed, but here's what happened. There wasn't $6 trillion to borrow over the last 2 years. There's borrowing authority, But then there's also who's going to loan you that money. And we've up until that point, we had accumulated $24 trillion of debt, primarily by borrowing from other countries, by borrowing from corporations, by selling treasuries to individuals, right, who wanted a safe investment. And so we had accumulated 24 trillion. But when you go out to borrow another 2 trillion, it's not sitting around. People don't have it to loan to you. So what happened, and what has happened again, and it is happening over the last 2 years, is the Federal Reserve created roughly $6 trillion out of thin air.
Right, according to M2 anyway, right.
Yeah, and according to their balance sheet. They had a fairly large balance sheet with some bad debt and stuff they had accumulated, but nothing compared to the 5 or 6 trillion that they've added to it. So I've got a debt clock here in my office, and it jumped, in the last 2 years, it's jumped from 24 trillion to 30 trillion. But the alarming thing, or maybe it's comforting to you, we didn't really borrow 6 trillion. The Federal Reserve created it, and then we borrowed it from the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, their balance sheet includes more Treasury securities than anybody else holds. Not Japan, not China. Nobody holds as much Treasury securities as the Federal Reserve right now. It was a shell game. And the reason I know I'm chronologically a little bit out of order because I'm talking also about the next 4 trillion that was spent, but it started on March 27th. They didn't find $2 trillion on March 27th to borrow. And this is why you have inflation and why it's not going away. It's baked in. There's 30% inflation baked into everything now. And that was one of my concerns at the time. And I articulated it. Go back and in the annals of Twitter, and you will find that I am saying this will create inflation and it will create shortages. So some people say, well, what did you accomplish? You didn't even force the recorded vote. Well, I think I proved that government could still operate, that we didn't need some contingency government to kick in. And I protected the Constitution that day. But also, look at what happened after that. On March 28th, or the next Monday, the White House announced, you know what, we're not going to shut down New York and other New England states. We've decided to leave them open. So it's sort of like by compelling all of those members of Congress to engage in interstate travel, I showed that it was still possible. Now, some of those members of Congress, there were 4 members of Congress looking at each other on an empty plane. But because we kept things going, they had to acknowledge you could still travel. So that, I feel like, is one of the things that was accomplished.
It's hard for people to remember these days. In fact, maybe you sense this too. I see an active campaign to forget, to pretend as if this never happened. I mean, even Fauci yesterday in testimony said, we never locked down. There weren't really any lockdowns.
By the way, I just remembered the name, General O'Shaughnessy. You can put that in a search engine in a Newsweek article. And also he showed up on Fox. That was going to be your leader of the contingency government. And they were introducing him to people that week. Go look at it. It's in the record. They can't memory hole it.
Okay. Well, there is so much more we could talk about. I think we should maybe, I hope, do that someday. But I think we should stop here because I know you're busy, and we have covered this early section really, really well. And I just think it's extremely important we know this history because, as I say, I'm sensing there's an effort to bury all this, pretend like it never happened.
Yeah, and there was a phone call with members of Congress and Dr. Fauci, just to sort of close this out. And I remember 2 of the questions that were asked, one by me and one by Representative McClintock from California. Representative McClintock from California asked, and this was around about that time, it may have been April or May, but McClintock asked, Dr. Fauci, in these policies, have you taken into account the effects the side effects of shutting down the government on the health of people. For instance, poverty is one of the leading indicators of shorter lifespans. And this is going to create some level of poverty. We're going to impoverish people by shutting down our economy. Have you taken that into account? And Dr. Fauci said, I'm just singly focused on this one virus, and that's what I'm working on. And that was a wake-up call to me. Very dangerous. And then the question that I asked was, I know you can't tell us the date at which you think everything should be opened up because there's so many issues. But what are the criteria that we need to meet in order for you to recommend opening our country back up? And he had no criteria because they really had no criteria other than panic for shutting it down. And that's when I knew we were in for a long haul and we were in for a lot of trouble as long as Dr. Fauci was in charge.
You figured it was going to last till November.
At least until November. Oh, Jeffrey, let me tell you one more thing. It's okay. So important. It's so important. Congress and my Republican colleagues in particular were arguing that it was too dangerous to vote in person in March. And then they turned around and by November, all 50 states implemented methods and procedures for our constituents to vote remotely. For the first time, we had a remote election, but Congress was setting the prototype for it on March 27th. This was a chess move.
Amazing. Amazing.
And I'll be honest, on March 27th, I didn't recognize it, but very quickly, within a couple weeks, I realized they were setting the precedent for remote voting in all 50 states by arguing if it's too dangerous for members of Congress who have paid government health care, security guards, very good ventilation wherever they meet, if it's too dangerous for them to show up and vote, how could you then later argue that American people have to show up and vote? So anybody who's upset about election fraud or how the elections were carried out or these drop boxes or the mailing in, your Republican members of Congress were arguing that it was too dangerous for them to vote, and then they set the precedent for everybody else to vote remotely.
It's weirdly ingenious, or maybe it's accidentally brilliant, or, God knows. I don't know. But, well, anyway, thank you, Congressman, for helping us. You're guiding us through these early days, which are so important. I'm very happy that you were able to set the record straight, and I hope we visit again very soon.
Thank you for documenting this for history, and I hope you etch this into a gold CD-ROM and can put it in a copper container that can't be corroded and save it in a time capsule, because the history is going to, the winners write history, right?
That's right.
And they're going to try and rewrite history. They already are. They're changing definitions. They're setting up a ministry of truth. They're doing all this so that they can establish history. And God bless you for trying to establish the real history with the facts of what happened.
We've just begun. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.